Everyone. Good morning. Does that sound okay? No. You hear me at the back on the microphone? Is that better? Yes, I think we're good. Right, so if we just let people take their seats, and I think Alex. Okay, good morning everyone, and a huge welcome to the People's History Museum in Manchester. My name's Katie Ashton. I'm the director here of the museum, and I'm just going to take really a couple of minutes to say hello and welcome. And we're absolutely delighted to be hosting the event and to have you here in the building today. I hope you have a really engaging and interesting and informative conversation about the launch of the publication that you're here for today. But really, it just feels really fitting that you're here in the museum. So just to tell you a little bit about who we are, for anybody who's not been, and do a little bit of plug of what you might be able to see after the event if you've got time to have a little wander or come back at another time. So People's History Museum is the National Museum of Democracy, and everything we're about is how we kind of developed a democracy in this country, but also around all sorts of different ideas worth fighting for, and really the importance of people power, how people coming together can make a change and make a difference. So we are the repository of the Labour Party's archive, which you'll find in our basement. We have close connections and a close kind of affiliation with the Labour Party, with the movement in a collection sense, in terms of the historical kind of work that we do. But we're also very proud to collaborate all of our work with communities, and the particular programmes that we've got on at the moment that you might like to see is this is the last month, so the very end of our migration programme. So we've got an exhibition called More in Common, which is all about Jo Cox's life and features the memorial wall that was created after her murder. And that's a real kind of collaborative project of bringing people together to talk about her ethos of the fact we do have more in common than that which divides us. And then throughout the museum, a whole host of things to do with migration experiences and people's kind of experiences of coming to this country for all sorts of different reasons. The upcoming programme we've got following that, which launches this summer, which you, again, more than welcome to come back for, is Nothing About Us Without Us, which is all about disabled people's rights and activism. So again, collaborative with the community, really kind of co-created, and we've been developing that work for a number of years now. So that'll launch this summer and run through for kind of 18 months. So everything we're doing here is really about using the kind of history and the heritage that we have in our collection to inspire people to talk about their experiences today and to really kind of talk about some quite contemporary issues as well. So all of our programme really kind of dynamic and lots of kind of different things you'll see without the building. So do have a chance to explore if you kind of get time today, but do come back as well. We are nominated this year, a little bit of a shameless plug, for Museum of the Year 2022. So we're one of 5 shortlisted museums, so really proud that the museum's work and the work of the team's been recognised. So I hope you love the venue. I hope you have a really good panel discussion and you get a lot out this morning. It's just delightful to see you here today. So have a great time and thank you.
Photographer, where are you? Yeah. Katie, thank you so much for that welcome. Thank you for this wonderful venue. It is fabulous. I am really looking forward to looking around the museum for the first time after this event, and I encourage everybody to do the same. And I know that you have to be non-party political, but it is lovely that it didn't feel like just hiring a venue. It felt like a collaboration. You know, there's Labour Business working together with the People's History Museum. And I wanted to add that your staff have been unbelievably helpful. There's Alex here, without whom we would not have a live stream or the screen or all the other technical facilities that you've offered so successfully. And also there was Jackie, I think is here. I'll say hello to her later, I hope. And Sarah, who I think is not in today. They've been brilliant, so please pass on our thanks to them as well. And for all of us in the audience, thank you to the People's History Museum. Now, let's get started. I'd like to welcome everybody who's in the engine hall and everybody who's on live stream on YouTube for the launch of, as you see, the Labour Business discussion paper on building a purposeful economy. I'm Hamish Sanderson. I'm the chair of Labour Business. For those of you who don't know about Labour Business, we are the business membership group affiliated to the Labour Party, affiliated but independent. Our members are Labour Party members in businesses, small, medium and large, throughout the UK, in all sectors. We were founded by Harold Wilson in 1972, which is a little clue for those of you with mathematical skills that this is our 50th anniversary, as you'll see plastered all over the banners. So we're very proud of the fact that we are leading a conversation with the business community. I mean, it was Harold Wilson who said that if Labour doesn't listen to business, there's no reason why business should listen to Labour. So that conversation is essential, and it allows us to gather evidence for the policy development work that the Shadow Cabinet and other parts of the Labour Party are doing in the run-up to elections. Not just the general election, but all elections, local, metropolitan, and national. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a lifelong member of the Labour Party, tribal Labour, I think it's probably fair to admit. I've been a parliamentary candidate, I've been a member of the National Policy Forum, and since 2015, chair of Labour Business. My professional career has been as an international lawyer, chair of international law firm, now chairing a global media network. And I am passionate about winning the next general election for Labour. And with that background, I hope you won't take it amiss, and I hope, Johnny, you won't take it amiss if I share some blunt truths as a critical friend of the party, precisely because I want to win the next election for Labour. And the first blunt truth is that for most of its more than 100 years history now, the Labour Party has faced a political situation where the Conservatives have been seen as the party of business. I think that's a truth. It's blunt, but it is true. That's why, among other reasons, they have won so many elections in those 100 years, because they are trusted, for whatever reason, they are trusted on the economy. The Labour Party, not so much. How shall I put this? Sometimes lukewarm on business. This is perception, not reality. Sometimes uncomprehending of business. Sometimes seen as anti-business. But, there's a very big but here. Under this Conservative Prime Minister, I believe the tide is turning. It's not just when he uses the four-letter word to describe business, a four-letter word beginning with F. It's also, not just words, but the actual crisis affecting the business community on his watch. I mean, we saw earlier this week the OECD figures. UK predicted to have the weakest economic growth in the G7, zero growth next year. Inflation heading now for 10%. The Federation of Small Businesses reported last week that up to 500,000 small businesses, it estimates, are at risk of going bust within the next few weeks. So, we all know we have a cost of living crisis, but we also have a cost of doing business crisis. And this government offers no solution, not even a plan for a solution. So, I believe that this presents a historic opportunity, I would put it as a historic duty, to reset the economy, to ensure that the support that, to be fair, the government, with support from Labour and the trade unions, gave to businesses during the pandemic is not lost when those same businesses go bust. And in that way, I think it is an opportunity for Labour to seize the mantle of the party of business, which the Tories do not deserve, in my view. And Keir Starmer and his shadow cabinet team have made a start, a good start. They've made it clear that Labour will support business in government, made clear that Labour is now unashamedly a pro-business party, pro-business and, of course, pro-worker. The two go together. But here's my second blunt truth for the Labour Party. It is not enough to say that we are pro-business. We've got to spell out what that means. Not perhaps yet detailed policy, but at least a direction of travel, at least broad policy themes, a vision of what the economy might look like under a Labour government. And that brings me to my third blunt truth. I don't think we're there yet. And that's not just me saying it. I talk to business people who don't yet know what it means for Labour to be a pro-business party, what it will mean for their businesses in the future if Labour is elected. And this discussion paper that we launched today is the first stab, a starter for 10, no more, to set out a blueprint for what it means to be unashamedly pro-business, for what the economy might look like under a Labour government. And the central argument in this paper is that business has to be part of the solution to the great challenges that we face, whether it's recovery from the pandemic or the climate crisis. It also asserts that business as usual is not enough. We can't go back to the pre-COVID model of business, which is totally unsustainable. And thirdly, that what we need to foster is businesses that look beyond short-term shareholder returns to a long-term, purpose-led agenda which puts people, society, and yes, the planet at the heart of their mission. These are the purposeful businesses that this paper refers to, and together they make up a purposeful economy. Now, this paper demonstrates that that is not a pie-in-the-sky aspiration. This paper sets out practical policy levers that a future Labour government can use to foster a purposeful economy, from tax incentives to company law reform to public procurement policies, targeted business support, and other measures. Nor, let me be very clear, nor is this vision an anti-profit vision. In fact, the paper, interestingly, sets out the latest research and analysis which shows that businesses with a purpose are more profitable and result in higher levels of investment, innovation, productivity, and yes, higher living standards for the communities in which they operate. And moreover, there are many models for this approach, as those of you in the audience will share with us later, I hope. Many models that illustrate that, quite quietly, the UK has become a world leader in cooperatives, in mutuals, and in other social enterprises. Now, we don't for a minute suggest that every company can or should become a social enterprise. What we do argue is that those purpose-driven businesses provide an example and plentiful data to show that all businesses can build upon that purposeful mission. Finally, on the paper, a health warning, a spoiler alert. As the title makes clear, I hope, this is a discussion paper. It's not the last word, and we welcome comments on it. We hope it will start a debate within the Labour Party, within the business community, within the wider electorate about how a future Labour government can foster a more purposeful economy which serves people, society, and planet better than the present economy. And that brings me to our keynote speaker. There is no one better qualified to take forward that debate today than our keynote speaker, who's thought long and hard about these issues and who is in a position to unite the Labour Party and the Labour movement around that purposeful business agenda. Jonathan Reynolds is the Labour and Cooperative Party Member of Parliament for Staley, Bridge and Hyde. If I hadn't said the co-op bit, he would have chastised me, I know. So I've learnt my lesson from previous occasions. Since 2010, he's had shadow roles in the last decade at Justice, Energy and Climate Change, Transport. He was City Minister for a number of years. And in 2020, he became Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. And then since November 2021, Shadow Secretary of State for Business, Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy. I think the Tories have removed the industrial strategy bit, haven't they? They don't have an industrial strategy, do they? No surprise there. So we are very grateful to Johnny and his team for providing the foreword to the booklet and for offering feedback on the text. They were directly engaged in the writing of it. But I hasten to add that Labour Business is solely responsible for its content. As I said, Labour Business is affiliated to the party, but independent of it. So we do fly kites. We don't write Labour Party policy. So what you read there is not necessarily party policy, at least not yet. So, Johnny, you're off the hook for now. And with those caveats, it does give me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker to address us. Jonathan Reynolds MP, Shadow Secretary of State for Business. Johnny. Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Hamish. Good morning, everyone. It is lovely to be here. That when Hamish read out that really long list of shadow jobs I've had, that really brings home the 12 years of opposition. But let me start by thanking you, Hamish, and Liz, and the whole Labour business team for organising today's event and for the hard work that's gone into preparing this fantastic discussion paper in front of you, Building a Purposeful Economy. Now, Labour business does play such an important role in our movement. It is the bridge between the Labour Party and the business community. And I think, Hamish, you are the embodiment of the pro-worker, pro-business message on the economy that myself and Rachel and Kia and the team preach at all times. And I think Howard Wilson would be proud, actually, of what you've been able to do in the last 50 years. You've not been there for all 50 of those years, just to be clear about that, Hamish, but you've done a brilliant job. It's also great to be here in the People's History Museum, not far from my home in Staley Bridge. As Katie said in that wonderful introduction, this place, if you're unfamiliar with it, it tells the story of working people fighting for their rights, from the Tolpuddle martyrs in the 19th century to the modern battles for equality in the workplace in the 20th century. But on my way here today, there was another chapter, and Hamish has referenced this slightly as well, in the history of working people of this country that I was thinking of on the way here, which is just as important, which is that story of the Rochdale pioneers, Hamish, and the cooperative movement. You'll be familiar with this, I hope, at the 28 textile workers who came together to set up a shop on Todd Lane to make food and other essentials available to their members at a price they could afford. They were inspired by Christian socialism, and their cooperative was based on democratic principles of one member, one vote, and the fair sharing of profits. And the legacy of those pioneers is immense. We do have a flourishing cooperative sector in the UK, which today employs 250,000 people and is made up of over 7,000 businesses. And it's great to have Emma here today from the Cooperative Party. As a Co-op MP myself, and the current chair of Christians on the Left, I hope in some small way I'm a little bit of that legacy too. But those pioneers, Hamish, they didn't just establish a cooperative. I say they created the first purposeful business. Their mission was clear. They wanted to make life's essentials accessible to those who would otherwise struggle to afford them. And I think this city is full of examples like that. If you're familiar with the Principal Hotel, which I still call the Palace Hotel, that was originally the Refuge Assurance Company, a company set up in my own constituency in Duckenfield that was one of the first financial mutuals providing essential financial services to working people. But this isn't just our history. It's also got to be our future. 176 years later, I think we do have the opportunity to build that new relationship between the Labour movement and those campaigning for a more purposeful way of doing business. Now, Britain is a great country to do business in. I am fortunate in this role I have. I mean, I'd like to be the real business secretary, not the shadow, but I can get out still as the shadow and see just how good things can be in this country, from watching in the last few weeks green hydrogen being produced in Sheffield to understanding the new applications of robotics in medical technology at Imperial College in London last week, to the continued innovation and pride of the steel industry in Wales that I saw last week before the recess in Port Talbot and in Shotton. And for me, Hamish, there's simply no reason why, with this potential, with this ingenuity, with this talent and vision, British businesses should have to accept another decade of low growth and lost opportunity. I mean, it has got to be unacceptable to open the papers and hear that we face a projection of having the worst growth in the G20 except for Russia. You know, business needs and deserves a partner in government who can deliver opportunities that will meet with their ambition. And we know how good Britain could be. And yet it is clear that over the last 12 years, the Conservatives have simply failed to realise that potential. The government, I know, will say that the sluggish growth we're talking about at the minute is caused by forces beyond their control, whether it's global commodity prices or the conflict in Ukraine. But honestly, that just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. They've been in power for 12 years, and their record has been consistently poor. I mean, had this government matched Labour's record in economic growth, we would be considerably better off as a nation. And if we could catch up with the growth rate of our best performing peers, by 2030 the UK would have an extra £75 billion in tax receipts to spend. What I hear at the minute all the time is right now working people recognise that their taxes are high by historical standards, and yet they can't get a GP appointment, they can't get a passport on time, and that's before we even consider how we should meet the challenges of an ageing population. I think never have the British public been asked to pay so much for so little. And it is precisely because the Conservatives have failed to understand the role of the active state working in partnership with business to achieve economic growth that they've failed. The ability of the state to not just respond to crises, but to create new markets, to create new opportunities, to be the partner people need. And I agree entirely with what Hamish said. Unlike the Conservatives, we have got to have that plan for the long-term sustainable economic growth across all parts of this country that we all need. Because we believe the economy can and must do better. What does that plan look like? Well, it means greater investment and ambition on net zero. It means a reform agenda on things like business taxation, and crucially, an industrial strategy that provides a route for every business and worker in this country to achieve their full potential. And the mission of that strategy is clear. It's to build an economy which is more resilient, more balanced, more productive, and more sustainable, to provide real economic security for everyone. And we know we can only succeed in that mission by working in partnership with business, with purposeful firms in a purpose-driven economy. And the good news, as Labour Business's discussion paper today makes clear, is that a quiet revolution has already been taking place throughout our economy. There are thousands of businesses here and around the world, from innovative startups to FTSE-listed multinationals, that are part of a movement for change. It's a business-led movement of firms with a purpose beyond the bottom line. They're businesses that have a mission that's expressed in different ways to protect and to promote the interests of their workforce, their local communities, and the environment, as well as returning profit where it's required. As the Better Business Act movement puts it, it's the triple bottom line of people, profit, and planet. And these firms know that it is the right thing to do, that they do have obligations to society in which they operate. But they also recognize that it makes good commercial sense. The work of Will Hutton and the Purposeful Company has consistently shown that businesses with a clear purpose perform better in the long run. They attract and retain investors, employees and consumers who are shown to prefer brands with a purpose. And they're more likely to be more resilient to economic turbulence. What's good for individual firms is also good for the economy as a whole. And as this pamphlet articulates, where firms prioritize long-term wealth creation over short-term shareholder value, it pays dividends for innovation and productivity. And that means higher levels of investment, well-paid and rewarding jobs across the country, and businesses playing their part in a just transition to net zero. The lack of sufficient long-term private investment in the UK is, in my view, at the core of our economic problems. And I think this agenda could be one of the answers to that. I also want to say that I'm aware there's been a pushback against purposeful business in the last few months, and particularly against the idea of referencing ESG objectives, environmental, social and governance issues. Some people are trying to put the argument forward that as times get tough, we've just got to drop this. But I have a simple message. This agenda is here to stay. And it's here to stay because it's what the public wants. It's what the customer wants. And people need to understand that. So if purposeful businesses do better, what is holding some firms back? Well, business leaders I speak to suggest that too often they feel the rules and institutions in the UK economy don't do enough to encourage purposeful business practices. They feel the pressures of delivering short-term returns to shareholders can sometimes weigh heavier than long-term wealth creation and shared prosperity. A recent survey carried out by YouGov found that only 15% of senior decision makers in UK businesses thought that the current legal and regulatory environment in the UK serves societies rather than shareholders' interests. And that's why a partnership between business and government is so essential to creating that purposeful economy. And this discussion is at the heart of the pamphlet we're launching today. There are many parts to this: taxation, corporate governance, competition policy, takeover law, and others. And I'm pleased we're having this debate, because a Labour government would use all the levers at its disposal, working in partnership with business, to speed up the transition to a purpose-driven economy. And I'm optimistic and excited by what we could build. So thank you, Hamish, and thank you, Labour Business, for being partners, allies, and friends as we embark on what I think is a really exciting mission. Thank you very much.
Johnny, thank you so much for that inspiring address, and there's a lot to talk about, but I'm really delighted to be able to say that Johnny is staying with us for the entire panel discussion, not just giving the speech and running, as some of his colleagues occasionally do. He doesn't do that. He's staying with us till 11:30. So you'll have an opportunity to put questions and comments to him and to the other panelists. So to facilitate that panel discussion, I'm very pleased to welcome to the panel my colleague on the Executive Committee of Labour Business, an international lawyer like myself, nobody's perfect, and he's also a senior advisor to Keir Starmer on business and diversity, Ravi Nair. Ravi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Hamish, and thank you, Johnny, for a super address. Just taking your inspiration, and actually, although people at home won't be able to see that there seems to be a poem, my eyesight is far too poor to read, but it says, pessimism is for lightweights. So I think, consistent with that theme, really the panel has its work cut out to make sure that we can really build on Johnny's really inspirational comments. And to that end, I feel very privileged to be joined by a superb panel, just going from my right to left, Lord Victor Adebowale, who many of you will know, and many progressives in particular will know, the former chief executive of the social care enterprise Turning Point, the current chair of NHS Confederation, and I think particularly importantly, the chair of Social Enterprise UK, and one of the first people's peers in this country. So we're extremely grateful to have you join us. Also, Andrew Pakes, who is a Labour Party politician and a former president of the National Union of Students, which is a great path, I'm sure, into politics. And you'll have lots of thoughts on our present education system, I'm sure, too. He currently works as a Deputy General Secretary, Head of Communications, Organising and External Affairs, I hope I've got that right, at the Science and Engineering Union, Trade Union Prospect. So welcome. And finally, Emma Hoddinott, who is the Assistant General Secretary, responsible for representation and political affairs for the Cooperative Party. And obviously that's particularly relevant because, as Hamish has already reminded us, Johnny is an extremely proud Labour and Cooperative MP, and we're very grateful to have you too. And so I think, just in terms of how we're going to use the next 40 or 50 minutes, what we'll do is we'll ask the panel to make some introductory comments, try and get a conversation going, and hopefully within, by no later than halfway through that, we'll turn to questions from the audience and really get you to make some comments. And I'd be particularly grateful if you think about some questions and some comments that you might have on the way that this discussion paper is ordered, which is that, first of all, it frames the opportunity for the Labour Party and the Labour movement. Secondly, it sets out a vision and a mission. And finally, to take Hamish's steer from the introduction, it may be that not everything is covered in this discussion paper. And it'd be really interesting if you think how we can take this debate on what you think the Labour Party, Johnny and his team and others should focus on next. So without further ado, if I could turn to you, Emma, just to kick us off, that would be fantastic.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invite to join this panel, not least with our fantastic Labour and Co-op MP, Jonathan, on this agenda. As Assistant General Secretary, of course, I'm going to sit here and say cooperatives are the answer. But they are part of that answer. As Jonathan said, Labour has a sister party that is born of business. We've had cooperative societies as part of our party for over 100 years. Being a movement not of business just won't wash. They can't put that argument to us. But we have seen that divide and rule approach from the Tories. And there was one particular point that I thought Hamish said that was really important about the cost of living crisis. Actually, the challenges that households are facing in terms of energy, food and skills are exactly the same challenges that businesses are facing, and there is a real common cause for us to come together and campaign on those issues. Cooperatives are the natural purpose-led business. We've got the history of that, and that distribution of power and wealth amongst that organisational structure inherently means they have that purpose-led business. And you've seen it in the pamphlet, a lot of that positive research that actually co-ops have been more sustainable and more rooted in their place going forward. We've got an ambition to double the size of the cooperative economy. I think that's really important as we move forward. However, the discussion is, how do we do that, and what are the levers that are needed to put that in place? And this is the hard bit, and I think the statistics about the framework not working for business doesn't work for co-ops as well, and actually there are some key things that could work going forward. One thing I did want to touch on, and is in the pamphlet, about employee ownership, and it does feel like there are real opportunities around employee ownership, and we'll hear from trade union colleagues in a bit, but putting workers at the heart of that business model I think is really interesting. We trail behind other economies such as the US, Italy and Spain in terms of our worker co-ops, despite some very high-profile recent conversions in terms of Riverford and Richer Sounds, for example, which have become worker co-ops. And we're starting to see some of that work coming through. You may have heard that Dan Jarvis set up the ownership hub in South Yorkshire, now taken on by our new co-op mayor, Oliver Coppard, which really is a hub to try and make it easier for that business model to strive, and for people to start up that business models as well. It's really interesting that in the document you pick up that people start down one business model. It's very hard to change once you'll get going. So actually making sure that co-ops, social enterprises, that type of business model is easy and accessible for those starting out. And we've got some really interesting work coming up in the next few weeks, actually, in Wales. We're in government in Wales, so really interesting to see the work that Hugh Ranker-Davies is doing in terms of employer ownership there and what is possible under a Labour government. But one of the key things, I think, and Jonathan touched on it, is the reform of tax. And there was one bit in the pamphlet that really stuck with me. Is it right a worker-owned co-op who reinvests all its profits back into local community pays the same rate of tax as a multinational that doesn't? The obvious answer is no. And I will leave my remarks at that.
Excellent, Emma. I hope we can do some follow-up on your excellent comments just in a few minutes. I think, Victor, can we come to you next?
You can if you want.
You've got a microphone just here.
Okay, I was just working out the stat. I was going to ask Peter about it, but anyway. So thank you very much for asking me to join this panel, and I love this place. You've got a really cool shop. I like to buy.
We'll visit that later.
Yeah, you've got some nice stuff in there. So I happen to be the chair of SE UK, very proud chair of SE UK. I also, I think I've got some business chops. I've founded a couple of social enterprises, and I'm the co-founder of a non-social enterprise business called Visionable. So I kind of know of what I speak. So I'm pleased to be here, and I'm very pleased that Social Enterprise UK was involved in drafting and setting up this pamphlet, which I think is a great read. I'm going to be fairly brief and make a few points and then shut up, really. The first thing I want to say, and it's great to see Rose Marley here, because I think your work with Co-ops UK is energising, and I think we do need to energise the whole co-op social enterprise movement, accessibility being the key word. So, first is that it's an obvious point, but it needs to be made clearly. Business is at the centre of our economic recovery. It's not It seems obvious, but we get distracted by the numbers. The government proposes a budget or an emergency statement, but it's the collective action of UK businesses of all types that will determine what sort of recovery we have from COVID and indeed the other ills that seem to prevail at the moment. I think it was the chairman of the Bank of England who said that we've run out of horsemen and apocalypses at the moment. But it'll be business that will push us out, and business in partnership with society. Whether we achieve net zero or whether we reduce inequality, and it's interesting, the people that suggest that we should, there's an option not to achieve net zero or tackle inequalities. That's an incredible statement of ignorance and irresponsibility. We don't have a choice, just in case you're wondering. I think the planet's got about 10 years. It's not as though we have an option to not deal with net zero. If Labour doesn't have a strong message on business, it's not going to win the next election. It's as straightforward as that. You're just not going to do it. I'm a crossbencher, so I can slag them all off. So I can say that without any fear or favour. Unless you've got a strong message on business, you're not going to win the next election. And in order to do that, Labour needs to provide an optimistic message around business that cuts through to the electorate, cuts through beyond business to the electorate. It needs to have a distinctive message around business. It can't just copy the Conservatives' backing business, partnership with business. They're all just so hackneyed and a bit boring. It doesn't really work. It doesn't cut through to voters. We need a positive, optimistic message about the power of business to make our country better. But we need that with obviously a distinct Labour critique of why we're not getting the most out of business today. And let's face it, it's not too challenging a prospect, is it? I mean, it's not, it's not so much an open goal as an open field at the moment, but you can to do that. I represent 100,000 social enterprises, and we're a popular and fast-growing. We're the fastest-growing form of business in this country right now. We continue to grow through the pandemic. We're more likely to employ women, people that look like me, people with disabilities of all kinds. We're more likely to operate in the poorest areas of our country. For every £100,000 you invest in a social enterprise, you will create 3 jobs as opposed to 0.3 in other forms of business. We actually pay more tax. Social enterprises pay more tax, and Peter will correct me if I get this wrong, but we pay more tax than Google, Starbucks, and Apple put together. We employ 2 million people in this country, and we generate more tax income for Great Britain PLC than agriculture and the entertainment industry put together. So it's not as though you have to reinvent the wheel. The solution to some of the challenges around connecting business with purpose are right here in this room, and it's just that we haven't made the most of that possibility. There's literally a hidden revolution, and Labour have got to lay, and not just lay the groundwork, but raise the ground for social enterprise and purposeful businesses now. It's not, you can't wait till the election. It's going to be too late to cut through by then. Once you're in government, events dominate, and do it now. We need new ideas because the old ones just aren't working. And it's not as though you have to re-educate the public. You start talking about social enterprises, young people are going to get what you're talking about. The public are going to get what you're talking about. Social enterprises, of which there are 100,000, are going to get what you're talking about. So there's a growing consensus in government, business and academia that embedding purpose into business is good for business and the economy. The government's own business-led review said the business which were purpose-led, we all know the stats basically. People like to buy stuff from businesses that give a damn, right? It's not rocket science, because they only have to look out the window to see the impact of businesses that don't give a damn, right? On their families, on their communities and on the environment. So it's just Labour needs to be brave enough to say it, and brave enough to do it, and brave enough to be it on behalf of the people that probably aren't in this room. So we are here to help Labour. Our members are here to help you build a new platform, a new vision for business in the economy. It is true, literally, that without vision people die, and without vision economies die. So I would urge Labour to be brave, grasp the nettle, provide a vision, and work with us to create that new optimism that the economy so desperately needs.
Victor, thank you very much for setting out the challenge. I mean, to slightly ruin Napoleon's attributed phrase, instead of being a nation of shopkeepers, it might be we need to be a nation of social enterprises. So, I mean, we may come back to you on how the rubber meets the road and specifically what we should do. Could I just invite you now, Andrew, from Prospect, to address us with your initial comments?
Brilliant, thank you very much, Chair. I could be very short and just say I agree with Victor. That would be one way of doing it. I was just thinking when you introduce yourself, Victor, I always love this phrase, crossbencher. It's the word cross, it makes me think of my mum. And I think I always learned when my mum was cross, I knew I should listen to her. So maybe the lesson is we should listen to Victor as a crossbencher in terms of this. So look, I'm really delighted to be joining you. I absolutely agree with this idea that as a movement, but also for Labour as a party, being pro-worker and being pro-business is where Labour should always be at. And the moment we deviate from that, and the party deviates from that, the moment we lose sight, not just of what business needs, but also I think the things that we all need as individuals who work, who are looking for sustenance, looking for our own personal purpose in terms of what's happening. So I've got a couple of challenges or questions I reflect on this, having read this, which brilliant contribution, I think, to this debate. But there's one first point I'd like to make, and that's being a trade unionist, representing members, going out to fight for justice every day, it can sometimes feel a tough gig. Johnny talked about being in opposition being a tough gig, and it certainly has been in the last few years. And I really want to start just by paying tribute. Bill was in the room a few minutes ago. Johnny's in the room. Bill Aston, a shadow small business minister. I'd really like to start just by paying tribute to Labour's shadow business team at the moment. I think when you look at the bench strength and the teamwork that's happening in Labour circles at the moment, the broad shoulders that are carrying that come down from the likes of Johnny, Bill, Rachel Reeves, Alison McGovern. There is such huge talent that I think we should all be finding spaces for these conversations to give those front benchers the space to think about what that next offer is. So firstly, thank you, Johnny. Thank you, Bill, wherever you are. We will have talked about him and he'll reappear shortly, so you should all say I said nice things about him. So let me just say a couple of points about those questions and then link up. I really love the fact that this pamphlet talks about purpose. So I think not just in terms of business, but in terms of where our society is. Purpose to me really gets to the sense of the foundation in which we can begin to come together again and solve so many of the common challenges that we face as a set of communities at this particular junction at time. And I think it's really good that we're in the engine room here, because I actually think prosperity is the engine of our ambitions. And I say that as a trade unionist and a cooperator. Most of us work for a living. Most of us work in the private sector. And business is at the heart of that prosperity. If I want to ensure our members get a fair share of the cake in the private sector, I want to see the cake growing. If I want to see public services well funded, I want to see businesses growing because they pay a higher tax return. If I want to be able to talk about greater security in work, I want businesses to have a longer term plan for the future and a partnership with my members and other workers in terms of what the skills and transition means. If I want success to be shared across our country and our devolved nations in terms of future ambitions, I want business to be part of a successful solution that allows us to talk about the just transition and allows us to use technology and low-carbon solutions as something that doesn't create anxiety, but creates new future prosperity for people. And I think, to me, that's really important. I actually think that the pillars that Keir Starmer has outlined around prosperity, respect, security are absolutely the pillars of the things that affect our current state of life. And the challenge now, I think, is for Labour to drop down from those headlines in terms of what those things are. And I think it is an era in which we are looking for purpose in lots of different ways, and business is an essential part of that. If you just think through the horrors of the last few years, we've gone through the divisions and the anguish of the Brexit debate. We've gone through COVID and a national trauma as well as individual traumas to families around the country. We've got what's happening in Ukraine. We've got a cost of living crisis which is causing misery for so many people. The golden thread through that is a sense of purpose and how we share and bring people back together, and about what kind of country and economy do we want to be. And it is brilliant to be in this venue, but sometimes in the Labour movement, we spend more time arguing about things in the rear-view mirror than we do looking at the road ahead. And this pamphlet, to me, is a really good example of how we do that. So there's two questions I always look at with, in terms of a union. I think this pamphlet starts to get to. I think we need to address the question of why are we working? Why are businesses and social enterprises in it? And what do we get out of it as individuals and workers in a world that's moving particularly fast? And to me, that is about productivity and growing the cake sustainably, but also fairly, and being able to have that to and fro. And it should be a dynamic space with business around it. And the second question is, how are we working? And what does that mean? And we've seen that writ large. I never would have thought 3 years ago we would be having a national discussion about flexible working and how we work compared to what we've had today. And I think that period of trauma we've had in the last 2 years reminds me that this debate isn't just about work. To me, it's about the old Mars bar slogan, work, rest and play. They are the conditions we all need for a happy and purposeful life, wherever you live and wherever you work. And we need to make sure people aren't in that space where they are working not just longer hours. There's some really good research this week about the intensity of work, even for people working from home, the choice that many professionals have. We are working longer, we are working more intensely, and we're seeing less of the proceeds of that growth or productivity coming to us. So I would say Labour needs a strong narrative on work as well as business. I find it fascinating that so many centre-left parties, progressive parties, we have an incredible offer to the British public about how we get even if you experience hire and refire, or you get even when you see what happens with P&O and some of those scandals. We have less of an offer to say how work can help you get on in life. And I think that sense of pride, that sense of purpose we have as working people needs to come through in the bargain and settlement we need to have with businesses and how we bring it together. So I think I'll draw my comments to a close to say, look, that bigger picture of why are we working, not just where we're working, how are we working and what it means to our life, opens up a series of questions in terms of the policy solutions which we've talked about from Victor, in terms of cooperation, in terms of Johnny, in terms of how we get there. And I'm really delighted to be here, part of that discussion, to give a worker perspective on it.
You can keep that. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you. Andrew, thank you for your comments. Really, really great to hear the focus on growth. And, I was very struck by prosperity being the energy of our ambitions as a movement. So I think that's a great theme for today, and how we can make sure that we talk about how we can keep growing as an economy and get that driving force back. Johnny, we've given you a bit of a rest, so can we put you to work to use the Mars bar analogy? Do you have any comments you'd like to just add from what we've heard?
Yeah, I'll be brief because you don't want to give a speech and then just give the same speech again. But I thought those were excellent contributions from colleagues. I think they illustrate the size of the coalition that's out there of different issues and people interested in this. I think everyone gets the tone of this right, and it's something I'm very conscious of, which is, look, this can't be a preachy thing, right? It can't be like me as a shadow business secretary, I think you should run yourselves like this. As you said, Emma, because there's real pressures on business right now. They're going to say, look, mate, you've got to understand what we're facing right now, and it is not easy. And we've also got to acknowledge that even people who were themselves historically strong Labour supporters in previous elections have felt at times that some of the things we put forward in the last few years in manifestos just didn't reflect the reality of their lives. They didn't trust us, even though they instinctively, emotionally supported us, and Bill and I and the team were very conscious of that. fundamentally, everyone gets it, right? Which is being pro-business does not mean you're for the status quo. And I often think, I mean, if I look at our existing policy commitments, ones that I've added to, some I inherited, I mean, you know, we've got our climate investment pledge, which is an incredibly significant commitment so this country could hit net zero in the way that everyone says they want to. Most people say they want to, but at the minute we're nowhere near to. We've got our business rates reform policy, our pledge to bring back a proper industrial strategy, not the warm words we get from the government, but a real industrial council and a proper way to do that. We've got the ambition to buy, make, sell more in the UK, to change takeover law with the public interest test, to get R&D spending to 3% of GDP, to make Brexit work with some specific proposals around things like a sanitary, photosanitary, veterinary agreement with the EU. There's the skills agenda, which doesn't sit within me, but is fundamental to business. Our pledges on reforming things like the apprenticeship levy, doubling the size of the cooperative sector is still my ambition as well. Look, what I fundamentally get is, right, we have not yet articulated a story which is more than the sum of those individual parts, right? That is totally fair. But if you look at where we have come from, I think, in 2019, the fact we're competitive, the fact we're talking seriously about an agenda, a possible agenda for government, it is a sign of progress. And it's this conversation, this kind of work, that I think will give us that story that we fundamentally need, which is, for me, about economic security for everyone at a time when people have really felt, even people who have been historically quite well off or might have considered themselves affluent, have experienced in the last few years perhaps things they didn't think they would experience. And Victor's point about optimism, look, you're entirely right, Victor. Look, we haven't always sounded in previous elections or time to time the kind of optimistic vision of the future that we need to be. And look, I mean, as to shadow work and pensions, as Hamish said, it is hard when you look at the levels of poverty that have increased in this country, the food bank need, which we're all familiar with, which has gone from a niche part or provision to a mainstream thing in every town and city in this country. It's hard to sound optimistic when the problems are real. So the way I picture is this, right? You can find in every part of this country genuinely world-class businesses, world-class practices. I mean, when I was at Airbus in Wales a few weeks ago, you know, their productivity is not just better than the national average, it's 6 times higher. 6 times higher. So there's no reason we can't be world-class. There's no reason we can't be good. So why then is the long tail and the median level quite disappointing, and why have the last 12 years fundamentally been ones where this country hasn't grown as it did under the Labour government? It hasn't grown as it did historically, to be honest, since the Industrial Revolution and the events that a museum like this records. And that's the story. You know, it's got to be about, we know things can be better because we know how good things can be, but let's get to a position where they are. That's what we're trying to do.
Thank you, Johnny. Thank you. I mean, does anyone want to comment on anything that their colleagues on the panel has said? I mean, for my part, I'd love to hear a little bit more from anyone who wants to take up the challenge, you know, how we can hardwire some of these excellent practices of social enterprises in this country into businesses which aren't social enterprises. You know, innovation, investing in people, these sorts of things. And I'd also be interested if anyone wants to comment on perhaps some of the relevant background around the energy crisis we've had recently, and that we sometimes speak as though everyone has acknowledged that this is the way forward, but actually, you know, Labour's arguments on the windfall tax have been preferred now, and what that says about the environment to which we're having this discussion. So if I can invite a free-for-all for a few minutes, who wants to go first? Victor, should we come to you?
Social enterprises, I mean, there are 3 things we could do that would encourage the already, I mean, because basically social enterprises have grown against, they've faced into the wind and kept growing without much support from government or indeed opposition for that matter. But the 3 things you could do: 1, we could look at business rates and replace it with something that enables a distinguishing between mission-led and profit-first businesses, so that there's an incentive to be mission-led, right? By the way, mission-led doesn't mean not profit, it means mission-led with profit, otherwise you're not a business, just in case. I'm all for profit, right? Just in case people are wondering. I think you could do more to change the discourse in schools, in the education system. You know, let's teach economics for sustainability. Let's teach business for responsibility. You know, the business of business is not business. It's actually community. Ultimately, that's what it's about. We need the death of a psychopathic corporation. It doesn't work. And we need to make more capital available for social enterprises and co-ops. I've just produced a a piece of work that looks at social investment, and it took a year or so to do it. And frankly, I was appalled at the discrimination against women, black people, and people regionally. And we need to stop that, because the next big businesses are going to be grown in those communities by those people. So if we could do that, that would be good. I mean, on the pessimism thing, I always think, you know, if you're lucky enough to be in this room, then you're too lucky to be pessimistic. The people that really need our optimism aren't in this room. They're the people that are paying, you know, £100 to fill a family car and making the choice between it and heating. So
Victor,
we should be optimistic. People need it.
Thank you for that. That's very helpful. Okay, Emma, can I come to you?
Absolutely, and it's going to become, I agree with Victor, panel this in terms of education, investment absolutely in social enterprise and cooperatives, but also I think there's something around our profile as well and image. And Rose, I can now see you from Co-ops UK. Great to see you here. We have a brilliant, vibrant sector, but often only we know about it, and I think there is something about working with you know, Labour business with our front branch to promote that in terms of that optimism and what's happening. And I think energy is a really interesting area where we are seeing that. So as well as being Assistant General Secretary at the Co-op Party, I'm also a local councillor and having to deal with Tory policy in local authorities as well. And in my town, in Rotherham, you may have seen this on the BBC News, the £150 rebate has gone to people who don't pay by direct debit. So over 30,000 cheques were issued, which caused huge queues in the centre of town at pawnbrokers and cash shops. And that's unfortunately been the headline, but it has been a stark reminder of what people are facing and how close people are to the breadline. People didn't want to bank those cheques either because they're overdrawn and the money won't go, or they literally couldn't wait the 2 or 3 days for the cheque to clear because they had to get the money on their gas and electric because they are choosing to heat and eat. And I think that policy and those queues in my town really showed the issue that we're facing, that short-term approach by the government versus that long-term investment and changing the economy. And Jonathan, I think you articulated that really well. How do we get that sufficient long-term view and investment back into the approach of government? And that's where we need to fundamentally change our energy market. So we're here in Manchester. There's the fantastic Carbon Co-op who is doing retrofitting, getting houses warm and secure so people are paying less on their bills. It's absolutely fundamental, and there's already a huge network of retrofit co-ops who are doing that job. How do we scale that up nationally? And also community energy as well, reducing our reliance on the big energy suppliers and having more local networks and distribution. Again, there are so many fantastic community energy projects, particularly here in the Northwest. How do we scale that up and make that happen so we get those fundamentally long-term changes rather than these short-term fixes that we're getting from the government at the moment?
Oh, a lot of food for thought, Emma. Thank you. That's great. And Andrew, over to you, and then we'll come to your audience just after you finish.
Brilliant. So I think on that one of those points there, thank you to Hamish and Liz for putting, I think, a panel of entirely of cooperators up on this panel, so that we can raise our profile. Outside of work, I am a director of the Cooperative Development Society, which is one of the UK's larger co-op housing and mutual housing bodies, which is really tough in the UK compared to other places, how we look at changing land values and cooperative and mutual housing. But we soldier on because it is a righteous cause. Yeah, I think I'll just talk briefly about energy from a slightly different perspective. Clearly, there's the retailer and the pain we're feeling now. You know, we should be ashamed that 60% of people in poverty are working. We should be ashamed that, and a definite shout out to my colleagues and siblings in Unison who are pushing on this today, we should be ashamed that people who go to work and look after us as nurses are now having to rely on food banks that hospitals and the NHS sits up. That is a shameful thing. So we should never shy in this from some of the difficult conversations about the relationship between business and labour. It is a power dynamic, and our job is to mediate and ensure that is a fair and open conversation in which we all get something out of it. Just in terms of energy, I represent a union that works largely in the energy sector, and actually there is the immediacy of the cost of living crisis, but it goes to something bigger, and that's the short-termism of British thinking, what we've seen after the last 12 years. We wouldn't be able to end some of the international shocks, but we'd be in a much better place if we had invested down the years in the future of our energy system, whether that was setting up energy networks and incentivising that through government so that councils had the muscle to develop localised networks, to diversify things. If we had actually got off our backsides and invested in new nuclear and new skills and new investment with a longer time, because unlike the light switch, you cannot flick on and off new energy infrastructure. Yeah, and there is a definite thing about this government and its inability to deliver long-term infrastructure because it is so chaotic and short-term, and that's not just Boris, that goes back 2010 post, but there's something British where we just have a trouble when it comes to building big kit, and actually the Labour Party should learn from some of the businesses behind some of this, because some of that longer-term thinking, the ability to deliver some of this giant infrastructure, we've got to have not just long-term thinking, but long-term R&D that Johnny talked about, and that's something that isn't just different between us and the Tories, it's how can a future Labour government change our historical record of the last 40 years where we have just not been good enough compared to Spain, France, Italy and our main competitors in doing this well.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for that. At that point, I'll open up to the audience. That's great. Does anyone who wants to ask a question want to put their hands up and see how many we've got at the moment? Great. Okay, should we take you, Sarah, over there, blue shirt, the chap at the back, with the jacket, you, and the chap at the front left here. So if we just ask you three to give your first three questions, then we'll go from there. Thank you for that. And you at the back, sir, give you the microphone. Thank you.
Hello, there we go.
It wasn't Tom.
Say his name again.
Would you just say your name again? And
Charlie Winstanley.
Charles.
Charlie Winstanley.
Charlie Winstanley, please go ahead.
So my comments feed in a little bit to the gentleman just before there, I think. What I was going to say was I think that I completely agree with the general premise here that there's a big opportunity for Labour to steal march on the Tories in terms of that reputation over business. I guess from a kind of a narrative and policy perspective, though, I think that we've been missing a trick not to understand that. I think that the sort of the term business, I think, includes a lot of different types of organisations here, and I think each one of them has its own sort of particular sort of area of focus. So, for example, industry, I would argue, and I think there's a huge opportunity here to take a big step towards stealing the reputation for being pro-business in terms of industry, and I think that's a narrative and a set of policies which particularly, I know the pamphlet talks about red wall areas and seizing the agenda on that, working politically in a red wall town, Brexit voting, post-industrial area in somewhere like Salford, you see on a day-by-day basis the levels of nostalgia and emotional attachment to the old industries, large-scale employers with skilled work on decent terms and conditions and decent wages, which used to really feed the towns around these kind of areas of the country. and the loss of those. You know, we talk about the levelling up agenda. I think, you know, if you were to look at areas which need levelling up and you were to look at areas which were once dependent on industry, I think you'd find that the map correlates quite significantly. So I think there's a huge opportunity here, and I think there's, in terms of that industrial narrative, I think that's something where industry in particular, I think, benefits from a lot of state planning, infrastructure, direct spending. And that's one section of industry. I think the paper really well sort of talks about the sort of corporate social responsibility agenda here and things like social value and all of that social value engineering stuff. I think that's particularly relevant for your bigger sort of R&D focused corporate situations. But then finally, if I just finish on the last one, which is a sort of topic dear to my heart to an extent, I think that the other narrative focus here, where I think we really have the potential to steal hearts and minds, is on your small businesses and your startups, because I think that really is at the heart of the entire sort of ethos. You know, there's no coincidence that Thatcher pegged herself as a grocer's daughter. Both sides of my family, my granddad worked in Leyland Daft, then quit his job, set up a corner shop. And what Victor was talking before about business being community, that corner shop used to run a Christmas club every year. Everybody in the village was on tick. He racked up massive amounts of debts, basically keeping everybody in that community with their shopping, with their groceries. My granddad on the other side basically escaped drudgery in Wigan by setting up a grocer's business. And I think in terms of that personal narrative, which feeds very well into your kind of millennial startups with a lot of focus on quality products, ecologically
Charlie,
sustainable
we'll just bring it to an end there.
Absolutely, yeah, sorry. But my point being that I think there's a sort of...
I wanted to find out about your aunts and uncles as well, but we'll perhaps after it. A very clear focus on small businesses, thank you.
Can we have a question from a woman?
Please, thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm Sarah. I run a social enterprise in Stockport called SAS Media. And we reduce inequalities through giving young people skills and education in the media. I'm a member of Social Enterprise UK. It's lovely to meet you, Lord Victor. I just wanted to ask, is there a question? Victor talked about it a little bit earlier, about people want to not support bigger businesses who are not meeting ESGs. Have you got any plans to tackle the likes of Amazon and how that is depleting our high streets? It obviously brings great convenience to people's lives, but as we know, there are a lot of things that Amazon do amongst other big businesses that are not ethical, that are not sustainable, and that is changing our community.
Sally, was it?
Sarah.
Sarah, thanks for that, Sarah. Okay, great. I mean, should we just take this gentleman at the front as well? Just because I'm not sure how much time we'll have. So we'll just have your question. Sir, if you could just be as brief as you could, and then we'll come to the panel.
Okay, I shall be as brief as I can.
Or very brief, please.
Oh, even briefer.
I'll be more precise.
Okay, I think one of my concerns is ESG brilliant, but one of my concerns is too often we focus on the E and we forget about the S. And, you know, there was some research done by Frank Lutz where he talked about kind of people before profit. And I think a real opportunity for the Labour Party is to focus on the society part of it and what we can do in actual communities. And the actual practical question part of it is in the kind of late 90s and mid-90s, I was involved in setting up the Northern Yorkshire Business Forum, which was a kind of regional network, and we're in the process of relaunching that at the moment. So we've got Rachel speaking at an event on the 7th of July. We're hoping to get Johnny later in the year. I'm going to chase you later.
So yes, yeah.
And yeah, so it's really just what do we think we can do to actually engage with the regional business community rather than just the city?
That's great. What was your name?
Sorry, Stuart Bruce. I run a communications consultancy.
Thanks, Stuart. Shall I just bring this back to the panel then? Johnny, I think there are probably a few for you in particular, but perhaps Emma and others might have something to say. So I think just headlines was, what's our relationship? We did hear you, I think, just about, so what's our relationship with the city going to be for some of the things we want to achieve? Charlie obviously focused particularly on SMEs, and then obviously we've spoken about big businesses and what we'll do from a policy perspective. And then I just think the last one, if I could give it to you just so you have it, is just on the S in ESG.
Yeah, no, I'm going to try and have a crack at all of those if I can, but in an appropriate amount of time. I mean, Michael, I'll address particularly your kind of question in terms of what's been going on with investment and how that comes across rather than the overall relationship with the city in totality. But look, I think you're right. You're obviously all right. You work in the sector. You know the changes there have been. And when I was saying, we've seen an interesting commentary in the last few months. I'm in a subsidiary of Deutsche Bank rated in Germany around allegations of greenwashing, some high-profile disciplinary action in one of the big banks around comments one of their employees made. I just think it is very important to recognise that the ESG agenda has come fundamentally from what people want to see in terms of business and investment, and particularly the big asset managers and how they come about these things. It is legitimate, I think, to say, what is the taxonomy that we're talking about? How do we accredit decisions? Sometimes businesses will say to me, it's quite possible to put two very contrasting visions forward and both could be signed off as being best in class when actually they're not talking about different things. So there are problems, yeah, but let's fix those problems because it's what people want, and you just can't get away from that fact. What should it mean long term? Look, the cost of capital should be cheaper for businesses who are addressing these things, because again, that's what the public want, that's what governments want, and that is fundamentally what we need if we are to hit the objectives, the ambitious objectives that we as a nation are signed up to. And if people think, by the way, politicians aren't serious about hitting those objectives, well, the cost of capital will go up because people will think, ultimately, you're not going to hold our feet to the fire on this. Now, I think what Stuart said at the front, that in ESG, E is sort of dominant, is a reasonable point. I think that is, it reflects, I think, a good thing, which is, look back to the 2015 election, environment, climate change, didn't really scrape the top issues the public were interested in. Now it's consistently at the fore. So it's some of that reflects where the public are at. But we're right to say we have to work on and make sure there is a consistent, legitimate, not something that's open to allegations of greenwashing or anything else, set of accreditations in place to address that. But I recognise that's where investors themselves are at, because you're recognising what ultimately the asset owners that you manage money on behalf of are talking about, and that's where we've got to be. Charlie, I mean, look, you will know Tameside exactly like Salford in terms of the conversations that I have on a daily basis. I think, by the way, that when we look at the changes that are happening anyway in the world economy, when we look at what net zero means, we need people in government that are from places like ours, whether it's Sunderland, where I grew up, Tameside, where I live and represent, Salford, because, I look back and I think back to those big changes in the economy, when I was growing up, obviously closure of the mines, the closure of the shipyards. I think many of the problems of this country do stem from how poorly this country handled that transition. And I think having people in power at the minute who not only don't understand what that meant at the time, but actually celebrate it and would do an even worse job if they got the chance of it, makes that even more important. Look, we can't be nostalgic, but we've got to recognise what you're referencing, which is, people want good jobs that they can build family life around, and that they can have enjoyment and leisure time around, and that is what they're talking about. The past wasn't great. We should always say that. But we should also be clear that when we're talking about things like industrial strategy, Charlie, it's not nostalgia for the past, right? When I was in North Wales a week and a half ago at the Shotton Steel Works, by the way, founded by people from Staley Bridge, what they are saying is their customers are saying, we need green steel, and we're not going to buy it from you unless you are compliant. And bear in mind that Steelworks has done everything from the panels at the Shard in London to the steel that's in the Burj Khalifa. I mean, they're exciting markets, but we're not at the minute got a government that's willing to be the partner to industry to deliver that. And when we talk about industrial strategy and climate investment, that's what it's got to be. Not a big figure of money we want to put in, but we will make and be the partner this area needs to deliver the jobs of the future and continue what is good about what we have at the minute. I will. The questions are so good, Ravi. I've got to answer them all. Sarah, I'm always very clear, right? You can't, as a Labour Party, or indeed as any politician, be sort of like, I like businesses, but only these businesses, whether it's big or small, or manufacturing or services, right? Because business is very varied. That's another point that Charlie made. But look, there is a legitimate conversation about the role of multinationals and taxation. We have very clear aspirations to change how business rates work to better reflect the burden and balance of business taxation, but also how things like the global, the minimum global corporation tax agreement should work and how that should cross-subsidise smaller businesses and how the system works at the minute. So yes, we've got clear plans on that. And I think, Stuart, I referenced your point, your legitimate point. And on regional businesses, look, that's what we're trying to do. We try and get out of Westminster as much as we can. More to do, absolutely. That's why I was in Wales and that's why I was in the Midlands before that. And we've got plans to continue that. But you're right, we've got to get to business in all its diversity with the messages that we've got. That's the ambition.
Thank you for that, Johnny. Look, I tell you what, just for the last few minutes, if we could just do it in this way, we'll come to our remaining panellists on just for about 30 seconds to a minute each. And I don't think we have time to answer any more questions, I'm afraid, but perhaps we could take 2 more comments, and we've not had many women ask questions or make comments. We'll come to you in a moment, and at least then we've had a couple more comments. So perhaps this lady in the second row and the lady at the back right there. So can I invite the panelists just to answer those questions, and then we'll come to the 2 comments? Or Emma, we'll do your response, then we'll get the 2 comments.
Yeah, just to be very brief, wholeheartedly agree with Jonathan's comments about nostalgia, that we're not going to go back to those large industries. They're going to be more fragmented and more smaller, and actually being optimistic, I see that there is opportunities using that cooperative model around collaboration. We've seen it in the technology sector, actually. Why could that be used for the industry sector as well, to give people that sense of community and working together, even though actually the way it works now is not going to go back to what it was. Just to touch on Sarah's point around young people and skills, huge agenda. I feel sorry for young people who are starting out now, the economic climate, and actually I think I'm quite optimistic about what Labour in government could do to address that and to really bring forward those opportunities. High streets is really important. The announcements already by Labour around business rates reform addresses those inequalities between the bricks and mortar and those big online corporations, that we really need to level the playing field there. And I think there's some really interesting work being done. Next week is Fair Tax Week, talking about business and tax. We're the first political party to get that mark. Lots of co-ops have the Fair Tax mark as well. I think that it's in terms of putting your credentials there about doing things better, particularly around tax, which isn't always the easiest issue to talk about.
And we'll just bring that
okay, and just on Stuart's point, I don't think you can separate the E from the S. The inequalities there, and environmentally as well, and we've seen that rural communities, car use and things like that. So maybe the S is part of the E.
Thank you, Emma. Very quick. We'll just have the 2 comments, if I may. And could I just ask you, just 30 seconds maximum, if that's possible, please. Over to you.
I'm Kate Welsh, and I run social enterprises in Houghton Spring, including the old rectory, so where Johnny grew up. And one of the points I'd like to make, and I think it's a potential missing element of this, is social enterprises and purpose-driven businesses create jobs for people who are furthest from the labour market. And we've got some real issues at the moment with many people now inactive in terms of where they're sitting in benefits and not being part of that, and that's because we're not inclusive enough in the businesses that are happening.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that. And do we have a microphone just at the back, Liz, or shall I come to a comment first? Yes, right, the lady at the back. Let's just do that first. I'm so sorry we've run out of time in the red zone. Please, madam, go ahead.
Hi there. It was a question, but I'll reframe it. My name is Kim Van Belois, and I run a CIC called Fresh Belief that focuses on environmentalism and supporting, through upskilling, a really underdeprived communities, essentially. But what I would like to see is a bridge between the educational system. I hear a lot about finances, but ultimately the agenda to level up, it requires some concentration, whether it's through our cultural capital at a primary level, but looking at the policies and standards within our educational systems to drive an upcoming generation that is going to support those businesses and support those initiatives. So that's a key focus that we're quite interested in seeing happen.
Thank you, and I'm sure Johnny has lots to say on skills, as do other members with the brief. Gentlemen, just your last 2, whatever you'd like to pick up, but I'll cap you to no more than a minute, otherwise I'm going to keep Bill waiting.
I'll be quicker than that. On City, great, I love it. Your report's got lots of green stuff in it, but let's think about cities beyond the city, because that's what we're going to have to do to build an inclusive economy. On SaaS, I think it's great. I mean, I use Amazon, but they should pay for their externalities. I don't understand why they don't, and so government should make them do that. It's not rocket science. On local and industrial strategy, one of the things that this government, successive governments haven't done, but this government, Labour government, needs to do, is invest in British technology, because too much of it's leaving the country, and when it leaves the country, the jobs go. So we should encourage incentives. And the final thing I would say is that we need to, the government spends a lot of money, change the, 2 things, change the procurement system, so you actually, my tax dollar actually pays for companies that benefit me and my communities instead of going out. You could do that, and you could do it tomorrow. It'd be very popular. And the other thing is, there's no such thing as a free market. Somebody always pays, right? So, change the markets, change the way markets are structured so that they actually benefit companies that make a profit by doing the right thing.
Thank you for that, Victor. Over to you, Andrew.
Cool. I'm going to say two very quick things. One, which is a crowd pleaser. One, which is a challenge back to all of us, including myself in this room. Absolutely agree on Amazon. It's not just the taxes that they should be paying and accountability. It's also their business model. And it's all of the logistics. Don't we all love, during lockdown, wanting to know where our parcel is? The moment you know where your parcel is, the moment you're buying into surveillance software and the kind of micromanagement in that logistics industry, which is now coming to supermarkets and lots of other industries. So there's a big moral question about how we challenge that. Finally, my challenge to you, and I think discussion, I think sometimes, and I say this as a trade unionist and a social enterprise supporter, sometimes we have to be careful about language and how it's heard. So actually, I think lots of people would bite your arm off to have a decent job in a big company. So we need to tackle the Amazons and not label all big companies bad, because actually they provide a lot of investment jobs and things in many countries. We also have to be careful about things like green jobs, because we need to be ambitious but tread carefully in a sea where trust does not exist. And sometimes we talk about really easy green jobs, and what people I represent here is that in places outside of London it means their good jobs will become lower paid jobs. And actually we've seen, just look at the A1 corridor, manufacturing jobs replaced by warehousing jobs. So when the Tories talk about low unemployment, and that's their mantra, we talk about the fact people don't have jobs they can afford to live on. So when we talk about green, let's define it. It's decent, it's unionised, it's jobs you can survive on, and actually make these quality jobs, not just green jobs. Because we're all in a bubble, a brilliant bubble because we care, but sometimes what we say in some of these policy documents doesn't actually hit the doorsteps well, and we've got to be the bridge to those conversations as well.
Thank you for that, Andrew. Right, I'll invite Hamish to come up. I'm sorry for anyone we've not been able to get to, but may I just say thank you to Jonathan Reynolds MP, Eda Hoddenot, Andrew Pates and Lord Victor Adebowale. It's a massively unwieldy and huge intersectional question that we've been discussing, so of course there's not enough time, but thank you. And if I could just ask you to show your appreciation for that. Over to him.
And from all of us, Ravi, a big thank you to you for facilitating the panel. And last, but by very means not least, I'm very delighted to introduce our final speaker with some closing remarks, Bill Esterson, the Labour and Cooperative MP for Sefton Central. He made the mistake of walking out of the room just as Andrew was singing his praises, so I want to associate myself with what Andrew said, in particular his incredible role, a critical role in the business team working with Johnny and others, and going back many years in this parliament and previous parliaments, championing small business, and with a real track record in the business world himself before he entered parliament. He is a gem, and he's crucial to this debate. He also, and I'm very proud to say this, is a really valued Vice President of Labour Business. Bill, we love you. Thank you for coming here today. Over to you, Bill Esterson.
Well, thank you very much for that glowing testimony, Hamish. In Medway, I was starting and growing a couple of businesses with my wife. It was also the same time I was introduced to the importance of social enterprises, and Peter Holbrook taught me much when he was setting up and running the highly successful Sunlight Centre in North Gillingham, near where I was a councillor, and Peter's gone on teaching me about the importance of social enterprises ever since, and continues to do so. Now, I just wanted to say a few words about what businesses want and what they tell Johnny and me and the rest of our team because they want to play their part in this purposeful economy agenda. They want to be part of the solution. And I boil it down to three things. They want a fair deal. They want a fair tax system. They want the kind of things that actually we're calling for. And when we say we want an international agreement on corporation tax, and when we want the online giants to be paying more in sales tax to fund the cut in business rates for small businesses, it's because it's evidenced by what business is telling us. And they pay their taxes. They don't avoid them like these big giants do. And they want a fair system. And they also agree with us when we say this is not the time for putting up national insurance, which is a payroll tax as well as a tax on jobs. And what businesses want is fair access to government contracts, which has come up a couple of times in the discussion about the way the procurement system operates today. They want prompt payment, and they don't want to be undercut through firms that exploit. So when we talk about addressing the scourge of fire and rehire, it helps employers who want to do the right thing just as much as it helps their workers too. And the second thing that businesses tell me is they want an industrial strategy. They want a strategy for the whole of the economy. Oh, it's lucky that, because we're just drawing one up, and we'll be publishing it in time for conference in September. And they want a strategy around investment in the opportunities in the low-carbon economy. And our commitments already to R&D at 3% of GDP, and in my brief in Industry Now, the £3 billion commitment to green steel, again, are there as a result of what industry and business as a whole is telling us. And they want that investment in skills that we've only had time to touch on in today's discussion too. We're short of 500,000 intermediate and advanced level skilled workers in this country over the next 10 years, and we've got to drastically change our approach to apprenticeships and to learning and to training in technical skills. But the same applies, by the way, to skills in how to start and grow a business and how to run a business and get the best out of people too. So that's the kind of agenda that business wants from us. It's the kind of agenda that Johnny and the rest of the team and I are very much committed to. And it's an agenda that is consistent with what Labour has delivered historically. We came up with the Automotive Council when we were in government to save and to revitalise the car industry. Not because we had all the great ideas ourselves, but because we were listening to the employers and the trade unions too. And it's a prime example of what a successful economy looks like. Successful economies, the IMF will tell us, are characterised by partnership between business, employers and the trade unions. And that is where Labour, going into government, will be, with Johnny as the business secretary, not just as the shadow business secretary. And we're already demonstrating success in our wonderful city regions with Labour in power. We do it in Manchester, we do it in the Liverpool city region, and of course we do it in Wales, where we are in government. And we'll do it again in government. Now, of course, Labour is pro-worker. The clue is in the name. But we're pro-business too. And they go hand in hand, don't they? Because well-qualified, high-paid jobs are good for workers, and they're good for businesses too, because a high-wage economy means more money to buy the goods and services of business. So we have, as a party, to spell out that pro-business, pro-worker vision. We have the story to tell. And this country has some fantastic, successful businesses that we can and do support, and that we can showcase as examples of the kind of businesses that we want to see thrive when Labour is in government. With our support, this can all happen. When we get into government, it will happen. And we have a message for the business community as well as for workers. With Labour going into government, the best is yet to come. Thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.